These are just characters who I think best represent the themes and messages of each of their respective franchises. So last time, we narrowed down what makes for a good lead in each of these franchises. Obviously, there is some overlap, as they are coming out from the same doors, but for the most part, they are catering to different audiences and themes. Of course, I'm not saying all of this is absolute, these are just my best attempts to try and find an objective measure for what sort of messages each of these franchises try to generally get across with these characters. Also, do take note, these aren't necessarily my personal favorites of each. These are just characters who I think best represent the themes and messages of each of their respective franchises. I'm trying to disregard more subjective matters like aesthetic and personal appeal, which would greatly affect some of these choices. Thus, if I don't end up bringing up any of your personal favorites, don't worry, their time might still come. I'm not making any promises. I'm just using these characters to make a point. For each franchise, we'll go through 3 honorable mentions before we get to the top pick. And in case anyone's wondering, no, there won't be any dishonorable mentions, as frankly this video is long enough as is, hence why I'm restricting it down to just 3, even though there's a lot more I could talk about, and frankly, trying to discuss the dud Sentais would more than likely give me an ulcer. But yeah, since we did start with the writers in the last one, I think we'll go the opposite way back and start with the Precure. Also, yes, please do note, there's gonna be a lot of spoilers in order to do a proper analysis of all this. With that, we'll start off in mine and likely a lot of other people's personal introduction to this franchise, Heartcatch's Tsubomi Hanasaki, aka Cure Blossom. To this day, she remains one of my top personal favorites, as well as a lot of others, and for good reason. She went through a great character arc, going from the worst Precure ever, to not only a competent fighter, but also a strong leader to the point that she could give orders to a veteran like Yuri near the end of the series. This was because of her close ties to her team, with each of them imparting a bit of themselves onto her, like Erika's assertiveness, Itsuki's discipline, and Yuri's resolve. In turn, she had an effect on them, most notably getting the hyperactive Erika to take it down a peg. And this is due to the fact that Tsubomi went against the grain of a lot of the Genki Girl leads up until this season and was far more reserved. This was because of a rather tragic experience from repressing her emotions for too long in order to support her parents' goals. This in turn led to some great and kind of literal self-reflection a la Persona 4, acknowledging that while she was deep down still that shy, timid girl, that was just as much a part of her as her other self. If that doesn't count as a great coming-of-age story, then I don't know what does. But yeah, overall, Tsubomi was just one of the best leaders of this franchise, not just for fostering changes in characters like Erika and Itsuki, but also by supporting the grieving Yuri and help her break the cycle of hatred emotionally and kinda physically. And in the process, she found acceptance for the most important person in her life, herself. I also did consider Miyuki Hoshizora, aka whom, upon reflection, I probably should have given a lot more credit back when I reviewed Smile, and I think I probably should have also watched the movie before I did my final analysis. In many ways, while I do still kind of think she checks off a few too many of the standard Genki Girl lead traits even outside of Precure, at times she was also shown to be a little bit more bashful and timid, not unlike Tsubomi, which is kinda surprising when you look at these two characters at a glance. It does end up making a lot more sense when you combine the events of episode 44 and the movie, which highlighted Nico, the living storybook character's influence on her. She was a loner for much of her childhood, and only really started to break out much later, and with friends that she seemed to be unable to keep in contact with. Thus, when she entered middle school, she tried to overcompensate for her lack of socialization early on. In that sense, it kind of paints her clumsy and awkward tendencies in a bit more of a tragic and yet also very relatable light for many viewers. The fact that there were hints of this makes the show an enjoyable viewing upon rewatch. Most of all though, these at times overly idealistic tendencies were called out by the likes of Wolfrun, Joker, and probably most damningly, Nico herself. Because while encouraging others to keep smiling might sound good on paper, denying them the ability to cry can be just as damaging as pure sorrow, as without it, you'll never truly be able to appreciate the power of a smile. And yet, by leaving her story on a cliffhanger, Miyuki denied Nico both. This led to our little fairy tale otaku having some great showings of not just superheroism, but also the importance of recognizing commitments combined with proper socialization. Really, not bad stuff for what was supposed to be one of the lighter seasons of the franchise. On a side note, a lot of this stuff involving Miyuki, as well as the next honorable mention, could be applied to Nozomi Yumehara, aka Cure Dream, but I do want to keep this to just 3, plus I want to save some of those talking points for when I actually do get around to reviewing the Yes seasons. With that in mind though, let's move on to the character and series that I'm still in the middle of reviewing, Haruka Haruno of Go Princess Infamy. Yeah, I'm still bummed out that this series bombed. That aside though, I do still think the Princess of Flowers was a great lead. Yet again, we got a character who was reclusive in her younger years, but was influenced by outside forces to become a better person. And considering that she did come after the previous 2 mentions, there likely would have been some sense of redundancy for many viewers, and yet, Haruka did something a little different. She really worked towards her goals. Now, of course, this isn't meant to discount the accomplishments of other leads in this franchise, as every series does have their own themes and morals. But Haruka really showed how much work can go into achieving anything, really. At the start of the series, it was shown that while she was certainly motivated, she was also incompetent at almost everything she did, be it sports, academics, or music. And as Twilight correctly put it, she was a far cry from her idealized image of a princess, and yet she also remained constantly proactive. When she wasn't practicing tennis or the violin, she was jogging or even pulling weeds, knowing full well that even little, unrelated activities could become somewhat building blocks for others. With this, she did gradually, and not instantaneously, became better at the aforementioned activities. Now, there is room to argue that some of her development was fast, but I would never call it rushed based on the limited airtime of the show. And regardless, it's great stuff showing how actual dedication is often required if you expect to accomplish anything, especially with the upcoming years of adulthood for many viewers. That said, there is a good reason I'm reviewing this right after the third part of my Gold Princess reviews and episode 39 of that series. Haruka's fall from grace and moment of self-reflection were some of the most brutally honest moments in the whole franchise, in that we will have to face the inevitability that at some point we'll all have to struggle through life on our own. Of course, it doesn't mean we'll never see our friends or family ever again, but people don't just stay in one place forever. Through the pursuits of our own goals and dreams, we will all change physically and emotionally, and in the case of the latter, that can also mean our opinions will change, like an amnesiac Kanata outright telling Haruka that becoming a princess just wasn't worth it anymore. For many, the ultimate despair isn't Junko Onoshima, but rather having no support for anything, in particular, your dreams. However, while we might get that feeling on occasion, the truth is we're often never lacking in support, be it externally or internally. And once we do accept the inevitability of despair, then we can truly start moving towards a better future with or even without friends by our side. Honestly, while writing this script, I kind of flip-flop between these 3 and the eventual winner, because they all at least brought one major positive that in some ways was better than some of their peers. Tsubomi had great character development and a very literal self-reflection moment. Miyuki had some great confrontations that really tested her resolve over her admittedly overly idealistic beliefs. And Haruka just dropped some of the biggest truth bombs when faced with the difficulties that come with pursuing your dreams and moving towards adulthood. Objectively, all of them told some essential lessons for their target audience, but ultimately, I had to go with the lead, who not only has elements of all 3, but also exposited some very relevant messages for now and likely into the future. だから私は戦い続ける。あなたみたいな存在のせいで悲しむ人が増えないように。From beginning to end, Nodoka Hanadera was one of the most shocking cures of recent memory, which I mean in the best of ways, and thankfully not in the Hollywood exploitative sense. This was because her backstory of being terminally ill for most of her childhood remained a constant and significant fixture in her story arc, and not just there for the feels. It not only gave her some very significant motivation for becoming a Precure, but also justified some of her quirkier moments because she was experiencing a lot of stuff like physical activities and socialization for the first time. As a result, it gave all of her actions heavier weight in that not only was she determined to live up to her responsibilities as a superheroine, but she also clearly wanted to live life to the fullest. Of course, those two goals kind of clashed, as you can't expect to live a long life when you're essentially a soldier in a war, but Nodoka had the resolve to accept the high risk if it meant others wouldn't be robbed of a fulfilling life like she was. That level of heroism and morals about appreciating life to its fullest would have easily made Nodoka a contender for the best. But of course, the one thing that put her over the top was one of the most intense story arcs, not just for Precure, but really for any show of this age demographic. While Healing Good accidentally became one of the most relevant Precure seasons ever, before things went south in the real world, there were always plans to cover themes of self-care, which really kicked in once this little twist happened. Having learned of her part in the creation of Darizen, Nodoka took her Precure duties into overdrive as she felt responsible for not only his current atrocities, but also the pain he had caused for her parents and even her physicians. More than many toy heroes in general, Nodoka knew the gravitas that came with being a defender of justice. And while her teammates were able to quickly convince her not to overexert herself, she eventually had to face a much more difficult conflict when the source of all of her misery came to her for help. It was here that they could have done the predictable save the villain and hope for a face turn twist, but considering how he had treated everyone, in particular herself, Nodoka realized something very important. In a franchise with antagonists who have kind of gotten off way too easy in my opinion, this was shocking, but also not uncalled for. While trying to save everyone is admirable, at times heroes do have to acknowledge when some are just beyond redemption. Darizen very likely wasn't going to pull a face turn, and even if he did, it wasn't going to just erase all of his previous atrocities that he never even repented for. Thus, even someone as kind and gentle as Nodoka recognized that there's a limit to how virtuous you can be before a situation becomes self-destructive, or more specifically in this case, toxic. And also, credit where it's due, Rablin was also heavily involved in this decision. Consulting her friend and convincing her to follow her heart, this rabbit was essential to the whole package called Cure Grace. Still, the final choice was Nodoka's, not only making it a fantastic showing of her resolve, with her sticking by her choice even after the show ended.
確かに、私はダルイゼンを助けなかった。今も気持ちは変わらない。
It was also a very relevant message that thankfully they did not hold back on. And as a result, the innocent little sick girl from the beginning of the series had become far more cynical and even kind of nihilistic by the end, but she also remained hopeful of the futures of humanity and the Earth. No matter how many difficult times lie ahead of us now, life will only continue moving forward. And while Nodoka Hanadera didn't start off as a heroine who could physically move a lot on her own, she did eventually become a character who in many ways represented the superheroines who are always looking towards a brighter future.
そういうのも全部丸ごと生きてくって感じ。
Moving on to Super Sentai, we've got leads who definitely put more emphasis on their teen dynamics, with the lead being responsible for fostering all of that development. After all, this is a franchise that encourages its viewers to have freedom to be whatever they want to be, not just the lead characters. With that in mind, once again, we'll start off with my personal introduction to Super Sentai with Magi Ranger. And yeah, okay, I'll admit, at least for the honorable mentions, there is some major bias. That said, I do think that much like his family, the fandom tends to take Magi Red, Kai Ozu, a little too lightly. In case you didn't know, the Magi Ranger team minus the 6th Ranger were all siblings, with the lead Red being the youngest brother. As a result, we had a team of young adults being led by a high schooler. Now on paper, this really shouldn't work, and kind of didn't when Kai was at his most obnoxious at the beginning of the series, but as the show went on, he definitely started to become the main driving force behind his siblings. This was due to the fact that while his brothers and sisters had locked in their life goals for the most part, Kai still had his whole life ahead of him, and as a result was able to give them some fresh perspective. Often, unintentionally, he ended up giving them solutions to problems they had never thought of. And more than often, he motivated them into action thanks to his ridiculously free spirit. Now, since he was their little brother, they naturally didn't immediately gravitate towards all of this, which made for an interesting dynamic that comes from actually being a family.
You got a family, Phil?
But yeah, Kai did at least make for an interesting leader, as while he didn't exactly impart the wisest of words to his team, he often did remind them of the basics, which at times are actually the best advice we all need to hear, especially when it comes from someone with a shared familial past, which, can I just say, some of these flashbacks are cute as all hell. Moreover, we do kind of become complacent as we get older, as we figure there's nothing left to learn or look back on, when really, that's not the case at all. This is best exemplified with Hikaru, the aforementioned Sixth Ranger, who was older than the rest of the team combined, being an ancient warrior and all that. He also acted as the magical teacher to the siblings, but ended up learning a lesson from Kai about how sometimes taking action is the first step to finding an unforeseen solution to a problem. Now granted, Kai didn't come up with this lesson all by himself, but his proactiveness was what led to it. So, while you certainly could call him reckless, which he definitely was at the beginning of the series, in his own way, Kai Ozu did become the fire that sparked his team into action. Moving on, we have what might be considered an unusual choice, Nobuo Akagi, aka Akiba Red. Yes, I chose the gag character from the mostly gag unofficial season of Sentai. Hell, most of the franchise's usual audience wouldn't have been able to even watch this when it originally aired, since most kids would be in bed by 1 a.m. And yet, from what I've heard, it was a relatively popular series, even earning an unplanned second season. And of course, a big contributing factor to that was more than likely Akagi himself. Now, putting aside how much I personally relate with this guy, who probably has one too many Sentai toys, as well as merch from other genres altogether, he also did go through a relatively impressive little character arc within just the first 9 episodes of season 1. Starting off as just another obnoxious fanboy, he did eventually take his role as a pretend Sentai seriously, and even managed to convince his team to get more into it. However, when seemingly given an opportunity to become an official Sentai team, he ended up taking things too far, literally breaking the fourth wall and letting an army of villains into the real world. From there, he did something not even a lot of official Sentai do. He admitted that he had screwed up, because if you're seeking to be called a hero, then you're no hero at all. That alone earned him the right to properly transform into Akiba Red, and hell, even get some offhanded acknowledgement from an official Red. Granted, this film was written by the head writer of Akiba Ranger, so it was likely more of a flex than anything. And of course, as a parody show, they didn't remain that serious throughout, but Akagi did show some great traits of a Sentai lead even afterwards. Most notably, he really pushed his team to be more creative with their delusions, which were really more their imaginations. As a result, while this wasn't a kids show meant to teach lessons of the day like official teams, he did end up expositing strong messages of maintaining a good imagination, which, you know, is kind of essential for our hobbies. After all, it is what helps us really appreciate everything we have, and hell, even outside of our hobbies, imaginations can be applied to a lot of things in our everyday lives, and thus should never be forgotten about even as we grow older. Akagi might not have been the bravest or most noble lead ever, but he certainly encouraged anyone of any age to expand their horizons. Just don't overdo it is all. Lastly, we have a pretty obvious one this time with Takeru Shiba, aka Shinken Red. Yeah, for any fans of Sentai, you've likely seen the hard catch of this franchise, Shinkenger, and hopefully not any cheap carbon copies. And if you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend checking it out, as it is a great beginner season for Super Sentai, thanks really to the whole cast, though they are supported by a fantastic lord in Takeru. If you couldn't tell by just the aesthetics, this show has a ton of feudal Japan themes in a modern day setting. Thus, the Red of the season was kind of your stereotypical feudal lord, coming off as pompous and even kind of Gary Stewish, with everyone worshipping his every action. And yet, throughout, he did clearly care about his team and would be the first to take a bullet for them, which, should be the other way around for somebody who is of great importance and had the Chosen One powers that can defeat the big bad. The thing is, though, he wasn't. In fact, to put it bluntly,
you're a phony!
As it turned out, he wasn't part of the Shiba clan at all, but rather just the offspring of a retainer to the family. He had been raised to act as a stand-in for the real heir to the clan. Thus, while he had been raised to be arrogant and proud, he knew deep down it was all a facade and he was making his vassals worship a false idol. Rewatching the series, it really paints Takeru in an unenviable position, especially after this scene, which, oh god, it still hurts. At the beginning of the series, it seemed like he didn't want a team because he thought they weren't good enough to help him, when in actuality, Takeru didn't think he deserved their help. Thus, he purposely tried to drive them away just so that they wouldn't get hurt for the sake of a fraud. In other words, it's one of the most tragic cases of a tsundere since Rin Tosaka. And yet, in spite of it all, he grew close to them, and in the end, he didn't have vassals, he had friends. Takeru's inspiring selflessness and dedication to his team really made him a top contender, and while he didn't win, he certainly was a Lord worth praise, though maybe not this much. Still, once again for the top pick, I went with someone who's kind of a combination of all three of these guys. Someone who's loyal to his teammates, while also giving them a variety of perspectives, utilizing his imagination. Call this a recency bias since this also came out in 2020, but I did have to go with the very sparkly red. We previously mentioned this series maybe a little too much during the Healing Good overview, but that's only because I liked both of these series, and especially their leads. Juru Atsuta, aka Kiame Red, was a character that many in the Sentai community were apprehensive of at first, fearing that he was just going to be another hot-blooded idiot lead with an annoying catchphrase who would end up stealing the spotlight from everyone else. So pretty much the exact formula of a leader that's led to the failings of many recent leads and the current financial downturn of the franchise. Thankfully, what we did get was almost the exact opposite. Whether or not you like his catchphrase is entirely subjective. Personally, I like it more than some recent Precures. What can't be argued is that Juru managed to avert many of our concerns. Yeah, he was a little hot-headed when he got his Hiyamikins, but otherwise, 90% of the time, he was more akin to the polite little kid in the corner who just wanted to hang out with the cool kids. As a result, he had a very childlike innocence to him, often wanting just to cheer his team on, while also bringing out the best in them in a sort of mentor-like status, not unlike Takeru. This was because he knew for a fact that physically and mentally he was inferior to the rest of his team, as much like Kai, he was the youngest member and still in school, while everyone else either had or were on their way to a full-time career. Though, thankfully, unlike Kai, he didn't try to hide this fact, and even tried to comply with their sometimes overly high expectations of him. Eventually, they stopped pushing him after realizing that he was already a great leader without necessarily even needing to be the best fighter. All he really needed to do was actually lead them with some very unique and yet really wise perspectives about how to approach life's many challenges. On that note, it is also worth mentioning that this show was written by the same head writer as Akiba Ranger, who I guess just decided to make the unofficial Sentai official by making a less geeky and more dorky version of Akagi, if that makes any sense. As a result, we got a lead who had a great imagination, which, thanks to the show's mechanics, brought everything he drew to life, giving his team almost all of their armaments and mechs. It not only made the team stronger, and in my opinion, gave them some of the best mechs of the franchise, but it also encouraged the children, and even kind of the adults watching, to be more creative. Again, the key message of Super Sentai is to let everyone be whatever they want to be. And in order to do that, sometimes you just have to keep that inner childlike innocence alive, and to always try to draw out the best in yourself and everyone around you. I truly do believe Juru Atsuta is the pinnacle of Super Sentai leads for being a combination of three already great leads, all in one creative and fun package. Also, any dude who recognizes that Chris Yukide is best girl is the truest man of culture. Last and certainly not least, let's talk Kamen Riders, and since we have kind of made a habit of this, we may as well start off with my first, Kamen Rider Blade. What can I say? I just have some strong beginner's luck when it comes to picking out a good first series. Granted, nowadays, Kazuma Kenzaki is more known for his memes, so much so that it ends up infecting characters in other franchises. As a result, I do think people end up forgetting that he was one of the most amiable of riders in spite of a lot of obstacles put in front of him, both from the antagonists of the show as well as some very internal issues he had to deal with. If he wasn't fighting the immortal undead, he had to deal with a ton of moral issues, be it a bad public perception generated by some of the smart villains of the show, or suffering from survivor's guilt from being unable to save his parents as a kid. As a result of this, he was originally very emotionally distant from everyone, not helped by the fact that when he did get close to others, they did end up betraying him. Thus, while he did try to become a better person after becoming Blade, he was still apprehensive of others, especially when all the other riders weren't exactly stable either. Yeah, I really like the show, but I'll also be the first to admit that these guys really need to sit down and eat some ice cream. And yet, in spite of it all, Kenzaki trusted all of them and managed to save them from themselves. However, while he was right to trust them, destiny wasn't as kind and would force him to choose between his best friend Hajime, who had unwillingly become the harbinger of the apocalypse, or the world itself. And in the end, he chose the third option, which involved becoming an undead himself. Because of this, the apocalypse was halted until they resolved their fight, but Kenzaki was determined to keep things in a permanent stalemate, which of course meant he had to isolate himself from the world and all the friends he had made. Kamen Rider Blade, in my opinion, has one of the most beautifully bittersweet endings in the entire franchise, as while the world had been saved, one man did have to suffer the burden of immortality. In other series, he would continue to fight for good, at times with an understandably embittered attitude, but still remain the truest of heroes. And before anyone brings up Zio, no, I do not consider that canon, especially with how timey-wimey that show was. That said, we may as well end with this clip. Moving on, and even kind of continuing with the connections to Doki Doki Precure, we have Kamen Rider O's Eiji Hino. In a season where the antagonists are literally called the Greed, we of course had to get one of the most selfless of protagonists, to the point they chose to be a penniless wanderer, going around helping whoever he could. Though not without good and very tragic reasoning. While Eiji might have looked like one of the most handsome hobos ever, the truth was he did have access to the massive wealth of his politician family. However, while he didn't actively protest capitalism, he also didn't want to rely on it, having seen the damage it could cause firsthand when he tried to use it to help others. What he thought was going to be a charity to help kids in Africa turned out to be a fund to support a civil war. As a result, he was forced to watch a village get destroyed by the very money he had given them, along with a little girl he had befriended. And as if that wasn't enough salt in the wound, his family then used their son's tragedy to gain brownie points and votes. With a backstory like that, you really can't blame the guy for choosing perpetual poverty as his preferred lifestyle. That said, this show did also address the issues of being totally selfless and not having a clear path in life. Eiji's want for nothing ended up making him a perfect vessel for a destructive power that was exactly that. The power to create a world where no one would have to suffer because there would be nothing in it. Of course, he didn't want such an outcome, but at the same time, he couldn't give up on his selflessness that, yeah, in the long term, was only going to harm him if he remained an aimless wanderer. Thus, ironically, it took a greed that he had befriended Aang to make him realize that he did desire one thing, the power to protect others, especially those closest to him. Eiji really did come close to taking the top spot for showing all the pros and cons of being selfless. And while the show ended up favoring the former, as writers by their very nature are self-sacrificing, he was still a very admirable example of how to live life with the bare necessities, though yeah, you probably do need at least 2 pairs of underwear. Last up for the honorable mentions, let's talk about the gamer doctor, aka Kamen Rider X-Aid. Again, putting aside the fact of how relevant this character has become well after his show ended, Emu was one of the most upstanding and pinkest of riders. Yeah, is anyone else weirded out by the fact that the lead riders of this year have more pink in their costumes than the lead Cure? Speaking of which, yes, I did partially pick this character because he more than likely was the inspiration for the top pick for the Precure. And while I will argue Nodoka ultimately managed to break out and become her own character, I also can't pretend like the core of the Dr. Cure wasn't there. Emu at a young age was infected with a virus, in his case a mutation of the Y2K virus through a video game. Yeah, just go with it. It eventually left his body, turning into a character named Pardo, who proceeded to become one of the main antagonists of the show. In turn, Emu decided to study medicine to give back to those who had saved him. And he especially became dedicated after learning that he was possibly the patient zero of the disease that was terrorizing his show. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities between these characters, but there are differences that ultimately kind of set them down different paths. Though comparing and contrasting the two, especially their relationships with their respective viruses, is probably best saved for another day. For now though, I will say Emu went through a very strong character arc. At the beginning of the series, he was probably one of the widest-eyed idealists in the franchise, often trying to cheer his patients up with copyright-safe games, plus little Bandai Namco since Toei had a partnership with them. And he was also a bit of a wuss who unknowingly had to rely on a split personality left behind by his virus. By the end though, he not only no longer needed Pardo, but also managed to surpass him. And for the most part, he still remained a very admirable doctor who above all else practiced good bedside manner, but also developed a good realist perspective, having seen how far people can fall even with the intervention of a good doctor. Honestly, it's pretty amazing he managed to retain any bit of a positive attitude with how many deaths he had to witness over the course of his show. As a result, he was a good role model for the younger audience, while also kind of reflecting what many scrubs like him would have to go through during their first years as intern. In some sense, Emu was a writer who managed to reach one of the widest of audiences, while also remaining an amazing character in his own right by being able to put up with all the stuff that went on in his show. The only issue I kind of have with this character was how he might have gotten too happy of an ending, though to be fair, that might be more of an issue of the show itself, and the fact that they wanted to do more V-cinemas with these particular characters. Still, Emu was a great character who showed the perseverance a good doctor needs, especially in these times. Helps that he also encouraged people not to consume too much ham. With all that said, yeah, I had pretty much picked out my pick for best ambassador of the Kamen Rider from the very beginning. I mean, he's on my back for God's sake. I honestly don't think I'm exaggerating when I say Yusuke Godai, aka Kamen Rider Kuga, is not only the gold standard that the writers try to live up to, but in general, all superheroes in Japanese media, Toei or otherwise. Based on just the key aspects of the writers, he excels as the average Joe, appropriate since his actor's name was Joe, who was thrust into an insane conflict in which as time went on, he learned the importance of self-sacrifice. And as just a character in general, he was one of the nicest and most likable guys ever, not unlike either of the other two toppers, as well as characters I've covered on this channel and plan to cover in future videos. And that trait turned out to be one of his greatest strengths, and also weaknesses. A major theme of this show was evolution, which was shown through both the main character and his power set. Starting off as just some wimp who mostly awakened his powers out of self-defense, Godai's first Kuga form was not at all that great in terms of power, and purposely in design. However, by the next episode, and as the series went on, he began to recognize the true scope of how many lives he was obligated to protect. It's a classic, with great power comes great responsibility, which, yeah, does convince me that Stanley's influence is still present at Toei. As a result, his powers did indeed become greater, gaining a bunch of form changes necessary for the situation when taking on enemies like speedsters, tanks, or tiny flies. And even those forms gained power-ups as the series went on. This was because Goldeye was constantly trying to improve himself even outside of the bug suit, making him a great role model for the kids and the job-hunting guys around his age. So yeah, summarizing it like that does make it sound like Kuga was just your typical superhero show meant to sell toys, which it certainly was. But at the same time, that simplicity was part of the brilliance of the show and the character. As the series went on, Goldeye eventually had to face the facts that not only were his powers becoming more dangerous with how potentially destructive they were, but they were also a necessary evil in every sense of the term. The antagonists of the show, named the Grongi, were an ancient tribe of humans who also went through a physical evolution, but definitely not a mental one, as they were nothing short of unstoppable, psychotic monsters. This did not bode well for Goldeye emotionally, as while these guys deserve no mercy whatsoever, it didn't change the fact that in order to defeat a monster, sometimes you have to become one. This was the fate that befell the ancient people who originally defeated the Grongi and had been arguably passed on to their descendants. In the case of Goldeye, it was the last thing a nice guy who just wanted to make others smile would ever desire. And after a particularly brutal fight where he took out a serial killer, he clearly became more of a Stepford smiler, just barely holding back his rage towards these monsters, which also happened to draw him closer to his most destructive ultimate form. Thus, appropriately, when he did achieve this form in time for his fight with the final boss of the series, they looked alike, showing how close and yet opposite they were. As while his enemy was enjoying every second of their fight as he had nothing to lose and likely didn't even care if he lost, Goldeye was a crying broken shell of a man. Because he had to bear the massive responsibility of protecting countless lives by savagely being another man to death. In many ways, he looked like the first thing away from the idealized hero of justice, and yet this might have also been that in its truest form. Kuga, the show, might not have had some of the most complex of overarching plots, with the antagonist just kind of being evil for the sake of evil, but at the same time, it did have some of Toei's strongest hero writing, just based on how much of an influence Goldeye has been. Every writer has their own signature gesture, be it a catchphrase or a flick of the hand. In Yusuke Goldeye's case, it was just a simple thumbs up, and yet it was all he ever really needed to get across the main message of pretty much any superhero. That being that even when faced with the greatest of adversities, we have to try and keep a positive attitude. After his final fight, Goldeye went on a little soul searching to try and rediscover his smile, and while we'll probably never know whether or not he succeeded, at least his message is being carried on to this very day. In the first part of this analysis, I brought up this clip of the OG writer Takeshi Hongo asking why life was important, and he did get an answer from the current writer at the time, Ghost.
みんなの命がつながって一つの命になるんだって。
Whatever opinions you may hold to some of these leads, this does seem to be the common basis to all of them. While putting some priority on our own lives is important, we also have to recognize that we cannot live solely for our own sakes. And the truly great leads of Toei will often try to teach their viewers how to perform this delicate balancing act. While our social obligations will change with the times, and of course our own physical ages, there will always be something we can do for others. Of course, not everything we do has to be superhuman. In fact, many of these characters do their best work without the fancy costumes. They can make a difference in someone's life with something as simple as a smile or even a thumbs up. All the while also encouraging the pursuit of our own needs through seeking independence, self-care, or of course hobbies, which I'd imagine some execs would appreciate the most. Whatever the case, these heroes and heroines will always be some of the brightest shining beacons for everyone to follow. Whichever franchise or characters you admire the most from whatever time period, never forget some of the basic yet powerful message that they all try to get across. Live the best life you can with the best people by your side. Thank you for watching my fanboy ramblings and likely over-analysis of these franchises. We'll likely revisit this series sometime next year, but for now, I gotta wrap up this year with some more highly requested big projects. First up on the docket will of course be the conclusion to my Gold Princess review, followed by the conclusion to my Symphogear TV reviews. Yeah, there's a lot of things concluding this year. Following that, I'm going to start work on my secondary channel, tackling certain media focused on small pieces of printed paper. Look forward to it. And until then, though, farewell for now, my friends, and, yeah, could we get some actual figures of these two, especially Nodoka? I mean, I just want to be able to have something to put alongside an X8 figure just so that I could do this with them. Yes, I am a nerd. Nice to meet you.